Thanks for joining us for this course, Yes, No, Maybe, Medical Marijuana and Your Drug-Free Workplace Program. Over the next hour or so, we're going to really dig into this issue to help you come up with the questions to ask in order to make a decision or to solidify your decision about how you're going to respond to this new law. I'll tell you why we decided to come up with this course. As we were traveling the state talking to employers, we found that they were falling in 3 separate camps as far as how they were responding to this new law. The first camp of employers were those that were saying, there is no way we're going to permit an employee to use marijuana, even if they have a recommendation from their doctor. We're too safety sensitive. I can't do it for public image. We're not going to do it. And even though the decision had some real emotion behind it, we weren't really sure they had a lot of thought behind it, of what the consequences might be for not allowing an employee to use if they had that recommendation. Then there was the second group of employees, the second camp, that said, absolutely, we would let an employee use if they had a recommendation from their doctor. Who am I to stand in the way of advice that their doctor would give them? Again, lots of emotion, but not really sure they'd put a lot of thought behind the consequences of saying no. Then there's the third camp that said, you know what, this really doesn't even have anything to do with us. We're small, or we know everyone, or everybody's family. And they just decided they didn't even need to pay attention to it. And if I'm honest, there was another camp too that said, Ohio's legalized marijuana? So we're all over the place, and our job in this course is not to give you the answers. We can't do that. Instead, what we can do, we can give you some considerations and questions to take into those discussions with your decision-making team about how you're going to respond to Ohio's House Bill 523, which legalizes marijuana as medicine. So with that, there are 3 key objectives for this course. Number 1, to increase awareness of business issues under Ohio House Bill 523. Number 2, to increase understanding of the drug-free operational issues for employers and employees. And number 3, to provide a framework to decisions you need to make related to policy, operations, education, and training as it relates to this new law. Our end goal is to provide you with a roadmap to navigate your decision. If you've not downloaded the handout you were provided with this course, please do that before continuing on. As we are walking through this material, we encourage you to pick and choose what information is most relevant to you, and use this as a guide for when you sit with your attorney and decision-making team to make your own yes, no, maybe decision about medical marijuana. For context, let me tell you a little about Working Partners. We are a small training and consulting firm whose primary mission is to help businesses address risks associated with the harmful use of substances. Specifically, we help workplaces implement and maintain a comprehensive drug-free workplace program, meaning we develop policies and operations, conduct employee education and supervisor training, and negotiate group price drug testing and employee assistance for our clients who are part of our membership consortium. As a framework, it's also important that you understand the role we play with our clients. Anytime the subject of alcohol and other drugs intersects with the workplace, there are 2 major considerations we're mindful of: legal issues and operational processes and systems. While we are not attorneys, we do partner with one that we work very closely with to answer questions and monitor the legalities of our work. What we bring to the table, however, is in-the-trenches understanding of operations, meaning how alcohol and other drug issues play out on a day-to-day basis. It's not enough to say, you can't do drugs at our company, or in this case, we will or won't allow you to use medical marijuana. Your decision about marijuana needs to be with your attorney, with respect to the legal issues and your degree of risk tolerance. But it's also important to think through how the policy will play out, too. The devil truly is in the details, and that's what we're bringing to the table today. So here's the legalese. The content of this course is meant for informational purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. Taking this course should not be used as a substitute for consultation with a legal professional or other competent advisor. And please, be sure to contact a licensed attorney to obtain advice with respect to any legal issue discussed in this presentation or regarding a situation specific to your business. All right, let's move on. Allison Scher, a valued colleague of Working Partners, coined this quote that pretty much sums up what's at the root of this push-pull we're having right now with marijuana. She says, "We're in the midst of trying to change our relationship with our culture's most widely used illicit drug." It's no wonder we're kind of scratching our heads right now, is it? In making your decision about whether you will or won't permit an employee to use medical marijuana, here's the bottom line. Under the law, employers are not required, but they're not prohibited, from allowing the lawful use of marijuana as medicine, unless, of course, it's prohibited by an authority. So you need to decide yes, no, maybe. And ideally, that decision needs to be made before one of your employees discloses that they've been given a recommendation from their doctor to use marijuana. Or even more awkward, if they tell you that as an explanation to why they've tested positive for marijuana on an employment-related drug test. Let's put a face to this issue. I'd like to tell you about 5 different employees, and after I tell you about them, I want you to identify how willing you would be to allow them to use marijuana if it was recommended by their physician. If you have your worksheet with you, I want you to put a little X under the number that best describes how you personally feel about the situation. Now, if you didn't print off your worksheet, you can rank them 1 to 10, 1 being absolutely I would not allow use, and 10 absolutely I would. And again, it's a scale of 1 to 10. Make sure you put an X by your number and 2 rules. Number 1, don't think too hard about it. And number 2, remember this is your opinion, not the opinion of anybody else within your company. Okay, here we go. So meet Derek. He is a 21-year-old applicant for a job that you've been trying to fill for quite some time. He comes qualified and highly recommended and tells you during the offer phase that he does have a card for medical marijuana, but he doesn't share why. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning absolutely not and 10 being absolutely yes, put an X under the number that best describes how willing you would personally be to allow Derek to use marijuana as medicine on his personal time to alleviate symptoms of his diagnosis. This is Cliff. He's a seasoned employee who's been with the company 23 years as your CFO. It's common knowledge that he suffers from Crohn's disease, which is a bowel disease causing fatigue and abdominal pain. Cliff shared that his online community is praising the benefits of medical marijuana and says he plans to discuss this option with his doctor. Again, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being absolutely not and 10 being absolutely yes, how willing would you personally be to allow Cliff to use marijuana as medicine if he indeed gets a recommendation from his doctor? Next is Ramona, who is a 2-year employee. She's had a few issues involving attendance and quality of work, but overall a pretty decent worker. She took a nasty fall in the workplace 3 months ago and was off the job on a workers' comp leave and is just coming back to duty. She's trying to avoid surgery by managing her pain with physical therapy and over-the-counter pain relievers and really wants to avoid having to use prescription pain meds. Though she hasn't shared it with you, her doctor has recommended medical marijuana to manage her pain. On a scale of 1 to 10, how willing would you personally be to allow Ramona to use marijuana as medicine? Meet Noah. He's a scheduler at a large trucking company. He does not have a commercial driver's license, a CDL, and he's not regulated by the Department of Transportation, but many of his coworkers are. You didn't know anything about his use of marijuana until he tested positive on a random test and at that point told you he had a card. On a scale of 1 to 10, how willing would you personally be to allow him to use marijuana as medicine? And finally, Bethany. She's been with the company for 5 years and she is an all-star salesperson. She primarily works from her home but does do site visits several times a month. Her territory spans a 6-state region. So what about her? Scale of 1 to 10. So if you used your worksheet, draw a line to connect your X's from top to bottom. Draw a line from the first X to the next one to the next one until you have a line. And I want to know what's the shape of your line. Is it a straight line? Or maybe it's zigzagged? Or in the shape of an inverted V? Actually, the shape of your line is not as significant as the thinking behind your line. So what did you base your decision on? Maybe you based it on things like the person's job duties and how risky or safety sensitive those duties are, the person's job performance history, how long they've worked for you, or how well you know or maybe even like or not like the person. Maybe you based your decision on why they're taking or planning to use marijuana, or whether they told you before you found out. What else? What's important is whether those decision-making considerations are the right ones for this weighty decision. For example, you may like knowing Cliff's reason for getting a card, which is his legitimate diagnosis of Crohn's disease. But should you ask, or do you even have the right to know your employee's health conditions? And even if you've known someone for a long time and maybe value their work, how do you know if or how their behavior might change if they were under the influence of marijuana at work? Does knowing the person or the length of time they've worked for you determine how safe they'd be if under the influence at work? Now that we've given medical marijuana a face, let's establish a basis for your decision-making process, then outline 5 suggested criteria on which to make your yes, no, maybe decision. First of all, get the right players at the decision-making table, assuming the decision is not going to be made solely by the company owner or CEO. If you are going to be gathering a group to take on this issue, who should be brought to the table? Consider staff members responsible for HR and safety, a union rep, if applicable and appropriate, corporate counsel, a representative from your drug testing vendor, and your drug-free workplace consultant. In short, those at the table should represent varying interests and opinions so that everyone leaves the table with a well-thought-out decision. The decision should also be proactive versus reactive, meaning before the employee spends money to get the recommendation and buy the product, then shares they are using it or tests positive on a workplace drug test. It's prudent to know what you'll do ahead of time in order to head off as much conflict as possible. And finally, the decision should be rational versus emotional. We don't want to base the decision on the person and or their story. With this decision, we need to get it out of the gut and into the head. So here are the 5 considerations to think through as you're making your decision. I'm going to lay them all out in a row, then we'll take them one at a time. Number 1 on the list, laws and authorities. You may be forced to be a straight-liner, not permit use in any situation, if there is an authority like the Department of Transportation or a related law that governs your decisions. You may have no choice. Number 2 is the degree of safety and security sensitive work you do and how influenced you are by public image. Number 3, attitudes and knowledge about the drug. The 4th consideration is related to your business operations and how much tolerance you have for establishing and following new operations. And finally, you need to consider the state of your current workforce. Do you have as many workers as you need? And could your decision to permit or not permit the use of medical marijuana impact that situation? So let's start at the beginning. Number 1, laws and authorities. But before we get into details, there's one thing we need to discuss. And that's the elephant in the room, the conflict between federal law and state law. While marijuana is still illegal at the federal level under the Controlled Substance Act, there are many states that have legalized it for both medical and personal use. This issue is significant enough that it is one of 3 showstoppers we'll be discussing throughout this course, meaning there are 3 issues that if they change in the future would warrant a new conversation and you would be making a new decision about marijuana as it applies to the workplace. As you know, marijuana is classified as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substance Act, which means there is a high potential for abuse, there is no accepted medical use, and there are no accepted safety standards for use under medical supervision. Could this ever change? Could marijuana be removed or reclassified? Yes. And if that were to happen again, this conversation would change. So how does this conflict between state and federal law impact the operations of your drug-free workplace program as it relates to Ohio House Bill 523? At the federal level, let me give you 2 examples of authorities that may dictate your decision about how you'll respond to medical marijuana. The Drug-Free Workplace Act of '88. You are likely subject to this act if you receive any size grants from the federal government or have contracts with the feds in excess of $100,000 per year. So if you are subject to this federal act, you may have to comply with the federal law regarding marijuana. And if you hire commercial drivers, CDLs, you have to comply with the rules of the Department of Transportation. And DOT clearly says that they do not authorize medical marijuana under a state law to be a valid medical explanation for a transportation employee's positive drug test, which means a DOT driver who tests positive for marijuana, yet has a recommendation from his doctor to use, that test will be ruled positive and he'll be held to the consequences of a positive test. But what about your non-DOT employees? Remember Noah? He works for a trucking company and doesn't have a CDL, but most of his fellow employees do. Do you want to have different rules for him than you do your drivers who are not permitted to use marijuana as medicine? Let's look at a few things at the state level. First of all, the marijuana law, Ohio House Bill 523. Of course, employers are responsible to what's in Ohio's marijuana law, and we'll walk through some of the details in a minute. But while we're talking about state marijuana laws, don't forget if you have employees working and traveling in other states, you'll want to work with an attorney to look at any laws that might be at play in those states. State marijuana laws, and for that matter, other laws impacting drug-free workplace, can be very different from state to state. Your policy and operations needs to be written with those dynamics in mind. What about the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation and their drug-free safety program? Outlined in this memo released by BWC, the impact of the new law on Ohio BWC and its programs is limited. It does not adversely affect the drug-free safety program, will not require BWC to pay for patient access to marijuana, and expressly states that an employee under the influence of marijuana is not covered by workers' compensation. And then they coach that the best way employers can protect their workers and themselves is to establish a drug-free workplace program, or if they already have one, to review and update it if necessary. There also may be marijuana directives handed down by state organizations that license or credential professionals, like HVAC and electrical contractors, plumbers, or people who offer counseling services or other types of medical services. So if you have any employees who have a state-issued license or credential, it's prudent to research those organizations to determine if they have authority over your yes, no, maybe decision. Again, it's important to check with your legal counsel to make the final ruling about these federal or state authorities and whether they mandate how you're going to respond to medical marijuana. And then there are some company-specific authorities. For example, your attorney, of course, who may have definite opinions about what they want you to do. Do you have a union? And if so, are they or would they or could they take a stand on the issue? It's also important to have a conversation about this with your casualty and property and health insurance providers. For example, if you do decide to accommodate someone's use, will your rates go up? Could that decision influence your insurability? Check with your landlord if you rent office space. They may have an opinion or a contract item about your decision. Do you need to consider the needs or opinions of your clients in making your decision? And what other authorities are you subject to who may need to weigh in on your decision? Let's dive into the operational issues of the actual law, Ohio House Bill 523. What does it say about the role of the employer as it relates to an employee's use of marijuana as medicine? First, the basics. There are 3 state agencies responsible for the operations of the law. Department of Commerce, responsible for overseeing the operations related to growing, processing, and testing the plant. The Board of Pharmacy, who is spearheading all of the regulations around dispensaries, registering patients and caregivers, and determining the forms the drug can come in. And finally, the State Medical Board, responsible for certifying physicians and qualifying the medical conditions marijuana can be recommended for. We're going to be going over a few highlights, but if you'd like to read more specifics about any elements of the law or the final rules about cultivation, processing, testing, and dispensing, visit medicalmarijuana.ohio.gov. They have been very transparent during the finalization of rules and practices with the law. And on this site, you can read everything they've worked on and sign up for email updates as they continue their work. Before we talk about how the drug will be recommended by doctors and dispensed to the patient, let's review the two chemicals in marijuana that are looked at to treat medical conditions: THC and CBD. THC is credited with being able to increase appetite, reduce nausea, and decrease pain and inflammation associated with several medical conditions. And then CBD is also credited with being able to decrease pain and inflammation and control epileptic seizures, which you probably have heard a lot about. The ongoing challenge is with both of these chemicals, we do need more research. Here's what we know about recommending. There must be a bona fide relationship between the patient and doctor, and the doctor visit has to be in person. The law also says that there is an expectation that the doctor will provide care on an ongoing basis. We know there's got to be at least an annual visit, as a recommendation to use marijuana is only good for 1 year. The doctor must complete 2 hours of continuing education in order to get a certificate to recommend, and the doctor can recommend marijuana for one of 21 qualifying conditions. So here is a list of the 21 conditions approved at this time, but remember the State Medical Board can add more if they see fit. I do want to point out that some of these conditions are diagnosed objectively and some of them are diagnosed subjectively. So we've got cancer and Crohn's disease and glaucoma, which can be diagnosed objectively with medical testing. And we also have pain, which is only diagnosed subjectively. I, as the patient, decide how severe or persistent it is versus a result of a medical test. For reference, let's look at Michigan. They've had a medical marijuana law in place for several years and routinely track the conditions for which patients are recommended marijuana. First, here are some of the state's qualifying conditions: pain, muscle spasms, nausea, cancer, PTSD, seizure, Crohn's disease, and AIDS. And here are the numbers. 92.87% of the people who received a recommendation for marijuana got it for pain. 23.39 for muscle spasms, 8.95 for nausea, all the way to less than 1% for an AIDS diagnosis. Note that the numbers don't add up to 100% because many patients list more than one condition on their application. But several of the popular conditions are diagnosed using more subjective data than objective test results. Here's some other information about recommending in Ohio. The patient must provide proof of Ohio residence. They do have to pay a $50 annual registration fee, but that can be discounted for certain people who can't afford it. And they can't operate a vehicle under the influence. And here's what we know about the forms. We know that it's available for oral use in forms like oils, tinctures, capsules, edibles, but the edibles are not allowed to be attractive to children, so no gummy bears, brownies, and those kinds of things. Patients are allowed to vaporize it using oil or the plant material. There are topicals like lotions, creams, ointments, and patches where the drug is absorbed through the skin. No smoking is allowed, so the plant material can't be burned, and no home growing. And these forms can change over time if the pharmacy board thinks that they should be. And now a few things about dispensing the drug. The businesses selling the drug, the dispensaries, have to be registered with the state. So just to be clear, no one will be able to purchase medical marijuana at a pharmacy or another type of store, just a special marijuana dispensary. The dispensary has to be awarded a certificate, which costs $70,000, and renew it at the same cost every other year. The employees working at the dispensary have to be licensed, which also comes with a price tag. Depending on the level of employee, the annual fee is between $100 and $500 a year. The person who purchases it has to be 18 and have an ID. You can get a single dose when you go to the dispensary or up to a 90-day supply. Now, each form has its own measure for what constitutes a dose, but for context, a dose of plant material is 1/10 of an ounce, and a 90-day supply is as high as 8 ounces. Each purchase of marijuana also has to be reported by the dispensary to ORS, which is Ohio's online prescription reporting database, a tool that helps track the dispensing of drugs to patients. And according to the law, there can only be 60 dispensaries throughout the state, and the number will be monitored and increased as needed. Here's a map of the dispensaries at this time. And you can always visit the state's website, medicalmarijuana.ohio.gov, to monitor any changes in those locations. All right, employers, here's the important part for you. Nothing in the bill requires you to accommodate use, possession, or distribution of medical marijuana. Nothing in the bill prohibits you from taking adverse employee action, like refusing to hire or terminating someone's employment because of their use, possession, or distribution of medical marijuana. And nothing in the bill permits a person to sue an employer for taking an adverse employment action related to medical marijuana, but of course always check first with your legal counsel. Remember, like we said at the beginning of this course, the bottom line is that you are not required, but you're not prohibited from allowing the lawful use of marijuana as medicine, unless, of course, an authority says you can't. Nothing in the bill prohibits you from establishing and enforcing a drug testing policy, drug-free workplace policy, or a zero-tolerance drug policy. Nothing in the bill interferes with federal restrictions on employment like DOT, or anything to do with the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation. And like we said earlier, the law doesn't affect the drug-free safety program and doesn't require BWC to pay for the marijuana. So that wraps up our discussion about the number one consideration on the list, laws and authorities. But it was number one on the list for a reason. This is a big one. And for many of you who are subject to laws and authorities at the federal level, you may be forced to be a straight-liner, to not allow any use of medical marijuana, no matter what your opinions are about the subject matter. So let's go on to number two, safety, security, and public image. My guess is that when we were doing the exercise earlier, safety sensitivity was on your list of considerations, meaning the more dangerous or risky a job was, the less likely you would be to allow someone to use marijuana as medicine. But what about other things like security and public image? Let's start with safety sensitivity. So if you're going to make your decisions about whether or not to allow somebody to use based on safety sensitivity, you've got to be sure these definitions and these positions are outlined in writing in your drug-free workplace policy. So let's take a look. When Working Partners helps companies determine safety sensitivity in their drug-free workplace policies and operations, there are two things to consider: safety-sensitive functions and safety-sensitive positions. A safety-sensitive function is an activity, a verb, what I sometimes call an ing, that if I'm doing it and I have a momentary lapse of attention, I could injure myself or someone else. Things like operating a vehicle or motorized equipment, handling combustible and hazardous material, working in a safety-sensitive environment. So those activities are the ones that you would not want someone doing if they were under the influence of marijuana. And then there are safety-sensitive positions, such as a laborer, carpenter, outside sales, mechanic, or warehouse worker. What gets tricky when someone's not in a safety-sensitive position, like Cliff, the CFO, in the exercise at the beginning, is that he sometimes does safety-sensitive functions. He drives to a meeting or to the bank. So if I decide to prohibit only safety-sensitive positions from using medical marijuana, and I allow someone like Cliff to use, what do I do when he gets in a car for a job function? It could really be awkward if I know he has a recommendation to use. He's told me he has a card. I know he's driving to the bank, and then he has an accident, and someone else is hurt. That's where it gets a little tough. Those are the type of safety-sensitive issues I need to think through in making my decision, particularly if I'm considering to permit some people to use. So what about security-sensitive issues? What are your views about permitting people to use who handle payroll or finances, who handle classified information and intellectual property? How about those who handle security for the company, like locking the building at night or monitoring theft? And what about those responsible for the safety and security of children or seniors, or professionals like architects and structural engineers? So not only do you need to think about safety, but security issues in your business may also influence your yes, no, maybe decision. And finally, public image. Do I need to be concerned about what the public or my customers think about my decision? If I hire child or adult care providers, am I okay with their family members knowing that we're saying it's okay if the daycare providers use medical marijuana? What about retail? What about alcohol and other drug professionals, for example, and other forward-facing positions? Because there are some public image issues here. In short, Does your company have concerns that your public image would be affected if you decide to permit or not your employees to use marijuana as medicine? So let's review. We're going to be looking at 5 considerations to think about as you're making your decision about how you'll handle medical marijuana. And we've talked about 2, laws and authorities, and safety, security, and public image. But let's look at the 3rd, which is knowledge and attitudes about the drug, about marijuana. A couple things I want to talk about just coming out of the chute here. Number 1, we need to be sure when we're thinking about marijuana that we don't compare it to other drugs. For example, there's no doubt that marijuana is not as lethal as opioids, but that doesn't mean that someone coming to work under the influence of marijuana is safe. And secondly, make sure you know where your attitudes and knowledge about marijuana come from. Maybe it's something that you've read or somebody that you've talked to or something that you've heard. Maybe it's an assumption or maybe it's personal experience. Let's take a look at a couple basics. First, there are over 400 naturally occurring chemicals in marijuana. While some are harmless, many of these chemicals carry their own dangers. For this discussion about marijuana as medicine, I want to focus on the chemicals that are unique to marijuana. Cannabinoids, specifically THC, which has been identified as the intoxicating chemical that causes a user to feel high. THC dissolves in fat, unlike alcohol and other drugs, which are water-soluble. Now, to be clear, this is not a fat versus lean issue. THC actually stores in the fatty lipids of the cell walls, any cell walls, but especially white cells that are highly concentrated in the reproductive area and the brain. Everyone has the kind of fatty lipids I'm talking about, no matter how much they weigh. Now, THC is fat-soluble. It has a half-life, which means it takes a specific and consistent amount of time for half of the amount of the drug in the system to leave the body. And it will take the same amount of time for half of what's left to leave the system, and so on. The half-life of THC ranges from 2 to 8 days, with an average of 4 days. So when a person who has a half-life of 4 days uses marijuana, it takes about 4 days for half of the THC to leave the body. And then another 4 days for half of that amount to leave, and so on. But if that person uses again before the THC is gone, the THC accumulates. So the more a person uses, and the more often he or she uses, the greater the THC accumulation. So THC is fat-soluble. It has an average half-life of about 4 days. It accumulates with regular use, and finally, the impairment lingers. Users are impaired for longer than they realized, and many of these impairments linger well after the high is gone. So the high is gone, but the impairments aren't, and neither is the THC. So just how long does THC stay in the system? We know it stays in the body longer than alcohol and other drugs, 30 days, right? Well, not so fast. It is tempting to put a hard and fast number on that, but it depends on a lot of things, like how much marijuana is used at one time, and how often it's used, when the person last used, the person's half-life, which remember can range from 2 to 8 days, how it was used, was it vaporized, eaten, rubbed on the skin? And of course, there is also the major consideration of potency or strength of the marijuana that's been used. This potency issue can be tricky, especially if I'm basing my yes, no, maybe decision on the marijuana of my youth. The potency of marijuana has increased pretty significantly over time. This chart from the National Institute of Health tracks potency of marijuana samples confiscated from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. We see a consistent trend of increased potency of cannabis over time, starting from approximately 4% in 1995 and rising to about 12% in 2014. Now, if I experimented with marijuana in high school, which was many, many years before 1995, by the way, the THC content would have been even lower than 4%. If I base my yes, no, maybe decision on what I remember about the marijuana of my days in high school, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison to the marijuana of today, or that which can be purchased in a dispensary under Ohio's medical marijuana law. In Ohio, marijuana from the state-regulated dispensaries can contain up to 35% THC for plant material and up to 70% for edibles. Compared even to just the marijuana of the 90s, what I can purchase in a dispensary is 9 to 17 times more potent than what someone could get on the street in the 70s, not the marijuana of my youth. All these factors involving accumulation and impairment can vary from person to person and from time to time for the same person. But we do know that marijuana impairment lingers and the THC accumulates with continued use, which really begs the question about known impairment risks and what it means to the job. Here's where the rubber meets the road with many employers we talk to. They say, Karen, the bottom line for me is, it's none of my business if my employees use marijuana on their own time, but I certainly don't want them to be impaired on the job. What's the challenge with this? How will you know? How will you really know they're impaired? Currently, there is no objective standardized measurement for marijuana impairment. A drug test, if you're using the right science, is court defensible to say that it's in the system. What it doesn't say is whether the person is impaired. We do have impairment measures for alcohol that are standardized, but one reason we don't have the same measures for marijuana is because the research hasn't been done to correspond THC levels with levels of impairment. And there are also some unique features of the drug itself that make measuring impairment challenging. For example, if we're talking about breath testing, the drug is dissipated rather quickly from the breath while it's accumulating in the brain. And levels of impairment can vary depending on how it's used, whether it's smoked or vaporized, eaten, or rubbed on the skin. And this is our second showstopper issue. If and when we do have an objective, standardized way to measure impairment, the conversation for employers will definitely change. Okay, so on one hand, we can't measure impairment. But on the other, if someone is under the influence on the job, there are impairments that can put the employee, their coworkers, and even the general public at risk. Let's look at a few areas of impairment. Memory, both short-term and long-term, which also can have serious implications for learning. Vision, including the ability to track moving objects, and depth perception. The perception of time can be impaired. So under the influence, the user can lose track of how long a task has been performed. Attention, which can get selective, meaning the user can get stuck focusing on one thing and not notice other things that are going on around them. Impaired judgment, which has clear implications for safety, especially if the user is behind the wheel of a car or operating a bulldozer. Think about the user who decides they can make it and pulls out too soon into an intersection or thinks they can squeeze the forklift into a space only to be met with the reality that they severely misjudged the situation. Reflexes and reaction time can be slowed, and users can overestimate their performance, thinking they did better than they actually did. The best person to judge how marijuana is affecting someone is certainly not the person using it. What's challenging for the workplace about these types of impairments, especially for supervisors, is that they are mental versus physical impairments. Society tends to define impairment in physical terms like stumbling, staggering, and slurred speech, things that are easy for a supervisor, for example, to see. But marijuana impairments are more subtle, harder to see, which also leads many to assume it's a safer drug. But the consequences of marijuana impairment can be just as severe, even if the impairment is not as obvious. The user can look okay, but it doesn't mean that they are okay. So we really have to take a look at our attitudes and knowledge about the drug, particularly that tricky issue of impairment, which is a perfect segue into the fourth consideration, and that is the ease of operations. What do I need to do operationally if I do decide to permit employees to use, or if I don't? A lot of employers want to make this issue simple, and they ask, why can't I treat medical marijuana just like other prescription medications? Bottom line, there is no such thing as a prescription for marijuana. Nowhere in the country is there a prescription. This is a major misconception. Instead, with marijuana, you get a recommendation, not a prescription. So what does it take for something to be a prescription? It takes FDA approval. So even if I have the condition, and even if I have a diagnosis, my doctor can't give me a prescription for marijuana. They're going to give me a recommendation. And this is another showstopper. If the FDA at some point approves marijuana as medication, we will need to change our conversation about medical marijuana as it relates to the workplace. So since it's not an FDA-approved drug, what's missing? Well, I don't have that big piece of paper that accompanies the drug like I do if I go to a pharmacy. I don't have information about dosage and administration of the drug. I don't have any information about how marijuana will interact with other drugs. I don't have directives for storing. I don't have information about adverse reactions, or most importantly, any warnings associated with the drug. Remember, in every state then, the responsibility for verifying the validity of a recommendation falls on the employer. Feature this. Let's say that the employer has 2 people that are tested. One tests positive for Valium and one tests positive for marijuana. If the employer is doing best practice drug testing, the system goes something like this. The donor goes into the collection facility and gives their donation, their urine sample. Then that sample is shipped to the laboratory, where they do a screening test on the sample, and then if they find something, a confirmation test. Here's the key point. If that confirmation test at the laboratory does identify a drug, the next thing that happens with best practice drug testing is that that result goes to a doctor, a medical review officer, who will call the donor at home to see if there's a medical explanation for the drug being in the system. So let's look at the person who tested positive for Valium. What happens is the lab found the Valium in the system, the result goes to the medical review officer calls the donor and says, is there a medical reason this is in the system? And the donor says, yes, I have a prescription. In that case, the medical review officer would ask for proof of that prescription, and if they got it, they would actually rule the drug test negative. The result would go back to the employer as a negative test, which means the employer doesn't know that the person's taking the Valium. But what about the situation where the person tests positive for marijuana? Same thing happens. The lab says there's marijuana. The result goes to the medical review officer. The medical review officer calls the donor to see if there's a reason why they tested positive. If the donor says that they have a recommendation to take marijuana, they have a card, a recommendation, that doctor, because of federal mandates they have to comply to, will report that result to the employer as a positive and will tell the employer to take up that situation and the fact that they have a recommendation with that employer. So guess what? The employer knows the person tested positive, and the employer has to determine how they want to proceed. So at this point, instead of the MRO verifying the result, the employer needs to do that. They have to verify if the card's legitimate, if the drug's being used according to doctor's recommendation. They need to know when the employee is going to use, if they're safe to work, or if their job duties need adjusted. If so, for how long? And is there anything else they could use in place of the marijuana? Let's mention a few other operations that will need attention if you decide to permit use. Employers ask, if I do decide to allow them to use, what do I do if they test positive? And is there a difference between if they test positive pre-employment? Or what if it's a positive random? Or what if it's reasonable suspicion positive or even post-accident? Will I treat all of these positive tests the same way? And out of frustration, employers who are so overwhelmed with the operational considerations will sometimes say, you know what? Since so many states are legalizing it, and so many people are using it, and since it's not as bad as opiates, and on top of that I can't find enough workers, maybe I'll just stop testing for it. And you can take it out. Of course, unless you have an authority that tells you you can't. But it also won't be a barrier for people who don't have a card, and there will be nothing in place to address safety issues. And this leads us into the 5th consideration that you need to think through in making your yes, no, maybe decision about medical marijuana. What's the state of your current workforce? Are you having a hard time finding workers? Are you concerned that if you put up another barrier, it will be even harder to find employees? There are a lot of employers who are saying they can't find workers who can pass a pre-employment test. Let's dig a little deeper. Let's take a look at the national rates of marijuana use. In a national survey, the question was asked of folks 12 years and older, have you used marijuana in the past month? In 2017, 10% of all survey respondents, age 12 and over, reported using marijuana in the last month. And in the 18 to 25-year-old group, that prevalence increased to 22%, 1 in 5 said they had used marijuana in the previous month. At the same time, the rate of positive workplace tests associated with marijuana is pretty significant. And of all the positive workplace tests, over 47% were positive for marijuana, the drug most likely to be identified in a drug test. And over time, those rates of positive tests have really increased. From 2012 to 2013, the rate of positive marijuana tests increased by 5%. The next year, it increased another 14.3%. The following year, increased by another 4%, and between 2016 and 2017, we saw another 4% increase in the rate of marijuana positives. And we have additional information showing the increased rates of positive tests in those states that have legalized marijuana for recreation. In Nevada, for example, between 2016 and 2017, the rate of positives increased 43%, 14% in Massachusetts, and 11% in California. So in addition to the increasing rate of positive marijuana tests, there are other workforce issues at play. The age of your workforce, for example, employee relations and morale. Another issue is blended workforce. For example, if you have employees that are both mandated by DOT and those aren't, or employees who are in safety-sensitive positions and those that aren't. And finally, the multi-state issue. If you work out of state, I can't stress it enough. Please be sure you're doing the research on what your other states are saying about the use of medical marijuana. So there you have it. Those are the 5 considerations that really need to be thought through as you're making a decision about whether you will or not permit the use of medical marijuana. Here they are: laws and authorities, safety, security, and public image, your attitudes and knowledge about the drug, ease of operations, and finally, the state of your current workforce. So after the decision's made, that doesn't mean your job's done. You still have some action that you need to take within your company. Let's take a look at 5. Number 1, prepare to explain your decision. Defend it. For example, you may need to explain your decision to hiring managers and supervisors, particularly if they have strong opinions about this subject matter. You'll have to explain your decision to employees with one of the qualifying conditions, to non-using employees, your union. And you'll need to be able to defend and explain your decision, particularly if you've said yes, if a person has an accident and they have a card. You'll also want to explain your decisions to customers and contractors and job owners if they ask, and possibly even to the general public. Number 2, you've got to research and refine your operations, again, particularly if you're going to say yes to the use of medical marijuana. You'll need to decide what you're going to do if somebody self-reports, tells you that they do have a card. You'll need to speak with your MRO about the testing process to see if any changes need to be made. You'll need to think through your verification process if you find out someone has a card. You may need to rewrite job descriptions and job postings, and what you'll say to employees when you bring them on board, when you orient them to your drug-free workplace program. Number 3, you'll want to declare your decision in your policy docs. Even if you're not going to allow employees to use, you'll want to be sure your policy is in good shape and that it communicates that clearly. But if you are going to allow use, you'll likely have to change your definition of illicit drug and look at your rules, particularly those around use, possession, what constitutes under the influence, off-the-job use, or what happens when someone travels to another state. You'll need to be sure that all your safety-sensitive functions and positions are clearly defined, that your testing methodology and your process is clear, and that the corrective actions section of your policy is the way you want it to be. What's going to happen if someone tests positive and they have a card? Number 4, you'll need to educate employees about your decision. What are your rules and expectations, particularly as it relates to medical marijuana? When will you test? What's the corrective action? And most importantly, what options are available to them if they need assistance? And finally, number 5, you'll need to train your supervisors. You'll want to tell them about your decision and why you made that decision. They'll need to know their role within your policy and program, what to do if they have reasonable suspicion, what to do if somebody confesses that they have a card, or what to do if someone confesses that they are using marijuana as medicine, or how to refer employees who may need assistance. So first you need to make your yes, no, maybe decision. A decision that will enable you to be proactive versus reactive and rational versus emotional if faced with an employee who's been given a recommendation for medical marijuana. Be sure too, as you're making that decision, that you've got the right players at the table and that they're educated about the issue and mindful of the 5 considerations we've talked about in this presentation. Your decision might not be perfect, but make it a goal to be as purposeful and open in your discussions. And then after you've made that decision, take action to be sure that everyone knows what to expect with this law and where to turn for more information or for assistance with any personal issue that arises in the process. So as we're wrapping up, let me leave you with a couple resources for continued learning and some more support. First of all, check out our website, workingpartners.com, and especially look at the marijuana resource section. You can also subscribe to our monthly e-blast, which will give you continued information on what's happening new with medical marijuana and other drug issues as well. And finally, here is contact information for Working Partners. We have a variety of resources available to help you update your drug-free workplace policy, educate your employees, and train your supervisors about Ohio's medical marijuana law. Reach out by phone or email to learn more about these resources or for assistance in making this critical decision. This subject matter can be complex, but it doesn't have to be difficult. So call us, and good luck making that decision.